guys, today I'm going to be showing you how you can make your very own DIY handmade paper. This is just like that beautiful textured vintage looking paper that I'm sure you've all seen in stationery stores, and you can make it all by yourself at home. And we're also going to be including some dried and pressed flowers as well. And if you missed my flower pressing video, I'll leave a link down below so that you can watch that, so that you can press some of your own flowers to include in this project. Here's some of the supplies we'll be using. We have a paper screen that we made ourselves. I'll go over that shortly. Of course, we also have the dried flowers that we're going to be including in our paper. We also have an immersion blender, but you can also use a regular blender if you want to. And we just have some scrap paper that's shredded up. You'll also need a couple of hard surfaces to transfer your paper to, like a cutting board. So here's a closer look at the screen. This is one that I had my husband make for me really easily with just some 1x2 wood. He just screwed in the pieces together and then also added some wood glue as well. He coated the wood pieces with some poly just because we're going to be submerging this in water, so we want it to be a little bit more waterproof. And then he stapled on the plastic canvas, so it's pretty easy to make even if you're not super handy. And in total, I think it probably costed like $5 to make. We're also going to be using some shredded paper to be making our new paper. This is just like junk mail and other normal printer paper stuff that I shredded. You could use all white paper if you want to. I find that the small amounts of ink are not really an issue. Sometimes the ink will turn like a blue or yellowish color when you make your new paper, but I think that's totally fine because some of the flowers turn your paper that color anyway, so it kind of works with the overall look. I'm starting off with about 2 cups of the shredded paper to begin with and covering it with water. I just want to make sure it's submerged, and I'm going to leave this to sit for about 10 minutes just to soften up the fibers in that paper a little more. After that's been sitting, I'm going to be taking my immersion blender to blend this into a pulp. You could also use a regular blender. I would just advise to not use a blender that you use for food. So I have this immersion blender that I use for my soap making and other crafts, so it's perfect for this. And I'm just going to blend it up with water now. I didn't really measure anything because these are just rough measurements, and we're going to be adding this into more water anyway. You just want to make sure it's as smooth as possible, so just blend it up until you kind of reach this porridge-like consistency. You're also going to need some kind of basin or container that you can fit your screen into. I have this plastic drawer that just comes from like one of our storage drawer units, and I just pulled it out for this, and it fits my screen perfectly, but this will totally depend on what size you decide to make your screen. I'm going to pour that pulp that we created into this drawer, and then I'm going to add more water. You want it to reach at least an inch up the side of your container so that you can fit your actual frame underneath all of the water and have it be submerged. So for me, I added 6 to 8 more cups of water in addition to the pulp. So now we're going to dunk the screen into this water mixture, and you want to have it the stapled mesh side up, not down. You would think it would be the other way, but when we press this out later, it's going to be a lot easier to have the top of this surface make full contact with what we're pressing it into. So as you can see, I kind of like slide my screen down one side and use it to kind of scoop up all of that pulp. I try to make sure it's completely submerged, and I just wiggle around in the water until the pulp kind of settles into a nice thickness. For this first one, I was probably a little light on the pulp and I needed a little bit more, so you can see how there are kind of like thinner spots on my screen. You want to be able to kind of cover up all of those little holes in the plastic. And if you don't like the way it's turning out, don't worry, you can always just slide your frame right back in and dunk it again and see if you can get a result that you like a little bit better. So you can see on the edges, you can kind of see some of those holes in the screen, and that's going to dry really thin. But I'll just go with this just to show you the process. I also like to rub my fingers along the side wherever there's a little bit of excess pulp. Anything that's sitting on top of where that wood frame is not going to transfer onto our cutting board very well, so I'm just going to go ahead and take that off now so that it's out of the way. I have some of these pressed flowers, as you can see, and these are like the really nice whole ones, but I actually prefer to use my kind of off pieces from pressing flowers for this project. I like to have those smaller pieces. I think they stick in the paper better, and I also think it looks nicer because I don't really think you want an entire flower in your paper. It just doesn't look as nice as having petals all over the paper. That's just my opinion, but if you want to go ahead and put an entire flower, you're free to do that as well. Just keep in mind that for these bigger pieces, they are going to tend to come out a little bit, so I like to use my finger and like really push it into the pulp, and I'll even kind of try to bury the petals a little bit, at least partially, because this helps to keep them from falling out when this is all dry. Keep in mind that some of these petals are still going to fall off when this is dry. You want to go a little heavier with the petals and you want your finished paper to look. You can see here that I really like using smaller pieces, and I'll even rip some of my flower pieces up into smaller pieces. So this is a really good project to use up all of those off pieces of flowers that you have from pressing that may have ripped or kind of discolored when you press them. This is a great way to put them to use. After I'm done placing all of the petals that I want into my paper, I just like to lift it up and let all of that excess water drip off. Just make sure that you don't tilt it too much, because if you have a larger piece of paper, that pulp might start sliding a little bit. I'm going to take a cutting board that's about the same size as my screen and lay it down on top of the paper pulp and petals. I'm going to squeeze this together, and you want to make sure you don't slide this around or move it, and keep it as still as possible. Again, I like to just let some of that excess water drip. Sometimes you can get a little more of the water out while you're squeezing these two pieces together. When it's flipped over, now you can see the back of the paper, and I'm going to take a microfiber cloth. You can also use a sponge for this. You just want something that's going to absorb a lot of that excess water that's on the back of this. And I'm just pressing down gently, and by absorbing that water, your paper pulp will release from the back of the screen and end up onto your cutting board. And as you do this a few times, you'll sort of be able to tell when the paper is coming away from the screen and when it's not. Sometimes it'll stick a little more, but you just have to do this a few times, and if it doesn't work out, then you can always just scrape that pulp right back into your basin and do the process all over again. So here you can see this first paper that I created is a little small because, as I mentioned, I didn't have enough pulp in my basin. But even though it's a little small, it still came out pretty nice. I like how when you make this kind of paper, the edges are really thin and lacy, and they look like they're hand-torn pieces of paper. So I'm just gonna put this to the side right now and let it dry. So I'm gonna go ahead and repeat this process. I'm gonna mix up a little bit more of my paper pulp, and I'm going to pour it into my basin. And now, since I have leftover pulp from my last batch and this new pulp, I should have a good amount. And this time I'm also going to try a different technique of putting the flower petals directly into the water, just to give you another option. I also like to use these dried flowers that are actually supposed to be used for tea, but I like how they crumble up really nicely. I like having all of these little specks because I think it gives a more vintage, like freckled appearance to the paper that I really like. So I just crumpled up a few of those into the water, and I'm also adding some of my normal pressed flowers. You could also try just opening up like a normal tea bag, maybe like a green tea bag, and adding those specks of tea leaves in. I think that would make a really nice effect. I'm going to do the same thing by shimmying my paper screen into the water and just shake it around and adjust any of the petals if they're floating off to the side. And this time I have a much better coverage with that extra pulp to create a more full sheet of paper. And I actually really like this technique of putting the flowers into the water. It helps to embed them a little bit more into the pulp so they stay a little better. The only thing is you have a little less control of where your flowers are. But if you want to go for more of like a free flow kind of arrangement, this is a really good way to achieve that. Sometimes when you place the flowers yourself, you tend to overthink things. So I think it's nice to just let it do what it wants with this process. I'm just rubbing off a little bit of that excess paper along the edges and letting the excess water drip off as well. So again, I'm just going to flip this over onto a cutting board and hold it in place while I blot the back of this with my cloth. And you will start to absorb a lot of water doing this, so you just squeeze it out if you need to. And with a larger sheet of paper like this, it's pretty important to do one edge of the paper at a time. So you can see here I'm concentrating on that top part, and then I can start to see when that paper is pulling away from my screen, and then I'll move on to the middle and then down to the lower part, and slowly you'll see the paper start to separate from the screen and transfer onto the cutting board. So here is the finished paper, and I think this one turned out really good. You'll see there are some indents from the screen. You can take a rolling pin or something flat and kind of roll this out. I actually forgot to do it for this batch, but if you want a smoother look, you can definitely try and do that. Just make sure you press really lightly so you don't displace all of the pulp on your cutting board. After you transfer your paper onto your cutting board, you just want to leave it in a safe place where you don't touch it for about 24 hours. So here's how mine looked after one day. And as I mentioned before, some of these petals will definitely fall off. It's kind of just the nature of the project. And I just like to rub my finger over it gently so that anything that's loose falls off now instead of later on when I try to use it in a project. And any of these petals that I'm rubbing off, I just stick them back into my little petal box and I can use them again for another batch of paper. Here is that first smaller sheet of paper that I made in the beginning of the video. You can see how the edges have more of those like scraggly thin pieces, and I'm just going to take those off right now. And when I compare these two papers side by side, you can see the difference between having a mostly clean sheet with those larger petals and having those speckled pieces from those dried flowers that I crumpled right into the water. So it's completely up to you which one you prefer. And I think it's fun just to try different looks and methods just to see all the different kinds of effects you can come up with. I hope you guys enjoyed seeing this process. This is a really fun project to do, especially if you're looking for something to do with all of those flowers that you've been pressing. I hope this was helpful. Leave me a comment and let me know what kind of projects you'd like to do with this kind of paper. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you again next time.